Those who live by the sword shall die by the sword. Perhaps this phrase is for no people more applicable than the Romans. From the base of the Tiber River, their tribe sprang forth to become masters of the Italian peninsula. At the tips of their swords, they forged an empire, stretching across the Mediterranean and swaths of Europe. But no matter how far they conquer, enemies remain at every border. All roads lead back to Rome. And now, a religious cult from the east has washed onto the shores of their homeland. These followers of Christ preach humility and forgiveness, and to turn the other cheek. Surely only the weak would willingly submit to such a docile creed. And yet, the prophecy that the meek shall inherit the earth inflicts the Romans with a superstitious shudder. Nevertheless, they keep their swords sharp. By the will of the gods, this is a time of war. Welcome to our series on the First Crusade. You might be wondering why the introduction to a series on the Crusades starts with the Roman Empire. For this story to be told and understood in all of its context, we must begin, like so many other medieval tales, with the fall of Rome. Although this takes place at least 500 years before the First Crusade, it marks the start of the early Middle Ages, and it was during the Roman era that Christianity spread to Europe. The interesting developments over the next several centuries will set the stage for the geopolitical conditions that facilitated the First Crusades to take place. What led to the conditions and motivations that saw tens of thousands of European Christians to take up the symbol of the cross and travel east? Who were the many different characters involved in this daring armed pilgrimage? What battles did they fight along the way? In this video series, we will try to explore the story of the legendary First Crusade and all the context around it in more detail than ever before. Because the Crusades initiated in Europe, we will focus on the Western perspective, but make no mistake, the events simultaneously taking place in the East are just as interesting and important to this tale. What makes the history about the First Crusade so fascinating is that it's a story that takes place at the intersection between these two worlds. And so, we will cover the events in the East with the level of attention they deserve. Throughout this series, every episode we shall inch ourselves closer to the decisive Battle of Jerusalem and perhaps beyond. So join us, back in time, to the pivotal moment for Christianity in Europe, the reign of Emperor Constantine the Great. It is the year 285, although at this time the empire was no longer at the absolute peak of its power and territorial expansion, as it had been a century earlier under Emperor Trajan. It was still incredibly formidable, ranging from its northern borders in Britannia all the way south across the Strait of Gibraltar, following the coast of North Africa to Egypt, and stretching all the way east towards Armenia, touching the Caspian Sea. The Romans were the indomitable masters of Europe and the Mediterranean. The empire was in the hands of Diocletian. While he had only been its sole ruler for merely a year, he realized the empire was too large for a single emperor to rule effectively. And so, he elected his trusted general Maximian to rule as co-emperor alongside him. Both of them would be in charge of a section of the empire and share power in order to smoothen out the administration. This wasn't a completely novel idea, as this form of governance harkened back to the pre-imperial days where Rome was traditionally governed by two consuls. Similarly, there had been dual emperorship before, but Diocletian intended to turn it into a full-fledged governmental reform. Diocletian himself would rule in the east, the territories under his control stretching from Illyricum to Egypt. As the senior member, he would carry the title of Augustus. Although the original capital city of Rome continued to hold cultural and political importance, the true power of the empire lay in the large and wealthy cities of the east. The only real contender to Rome's expansion was the large Sasanian Empire along its eastern border, and so naturally protecting these provinces was considered more crucial than campaigning along the various barbarian frontiers in the north. Maximian would be designated as Caesar in the west, responsible for the provinces in Western Europe and the domains along the North African coastline. Symbolically, their partnership was portrayed in divine terms. Diocletian was aligned with Jupiter, the supreme authority of the Roman pantheon, embodying order and overall command. Meanwhile, Maximian was associated with Hercules, the heroic demigod renowned for his strength, endurance, and martial prowess. Within a year, he would rise to the status of Augustus as well, becoming the formal equal to Diocletian. During this time, a treacherous Roman general by the name of Carausius revolts and creates an independent breakaway state in Britannia and northern Gaul that went largely unchallenged. The inability to properly subdue this uprising proved that even with two simultaneous emperors, their leadership still stretched thin. Despite this initial setback, the two men successfully ruled the empire together for almost a decade, until they decided it was time to elect junior members to the team. Two veteran military officers by the names of Galerius and Constantius were appointed as Caesars to help govern the empire. With this decision, the tetrarchal system, where 4 emperors ruled simultaneously, was established. The empire was split into 4 administrative sections accordingly. Diocletian continued ruling from the east, but petitioned the central part of the empire so it could be assigned to Galerius. Maximian continued to rule Italy, Spain, and Africa, but handed command over Gaul and the frontier of Britannia to Constantius. The further division reaped almost immediate success, with both the newly appointed Galerius and Constantius proving their worth by achieving significant military victories on the frontier regions. Constantius defeated the rebellious forces in northern Gaul, which initiated the reversal of the rebellious occupation of Britannia. In the meantime, he continued to lay waste to the troublesome Franks and Alemanni tribes in order to secure the Rhine frontier. After a series of battles in Armenia against an invading Persian army, Galerius managed to pull off a cunning surprise attack that inflicted a crippling defeat upon the Sasanian Empire and pushed their forces all the way back to Babylon before he returned victoriously to the empire. With decisive military success on every frontier, and the empire stabilized by the joint rule of 4 competent emperors, the future of Rome looked bright indeed. For centuries, the religious life of the Roman world had been defined by their pantheon of gods, Jupiter, Mars, Venus, and other deities. But a new and initially marginal faith had emerged from the eastern province of Judea. Christianity initially started as a movement within Judaism, centered around the teachings of Jesus of Nazareth, whose followers believed him to be the long-awaited Messiah. After a series of Jewish revolts, the province had been renamed to Syria Palestina, possibly to sever its relation with the upstart Jewish population. Under the continued Roman domination that had crushed the Jewish revolts and burned their temples and holy places, Judaism was forced to reform. It's been about 250 years since the Messiah, Jesus Christ, was martyred in Jerusalem. It was at the hands of the Romans' cruel torture and execution method called crucifixion, designed to punish the lowest criminals in the most humiliating way possible, that the symbol of the cross emerged. Early Christians weren't discouraged by the crucifixion of their Messiah. Instead, they embraced it as a central part of their religion. Despite persecutions, the Christian faith that emerged from this province gradually began to spread through the empire. In contrast to traditional Roman religion that featured a multitude of competing deities, Christianity offered a single universal God and a promise of personal salvation that transcended class, ethnicity, and status. These conditions made it an attractive religion to adopt, especially amongst the lower classes in the densely packed urban centers. But unlike other pagan religions that often found some form of adoption within the pantheon, the Abrahamic persistence of a single god could not be fitted within the system, making their communities unpopular with the Roman establishment. The city of Rome in particular was important for Western Christians, for the church there carries an important legacy. It is said in the Gospels that as one of the most important disciples, the Apostle Peter had been given the keys to heaven by Jesus himself. "Blessed are you, Peter. You are the rock upon which I will build my church, and the gates of hell shall not prevail against it. I will give you the keys to the kingdom of heaven. Whatever you forbid on earth will be forbidden in heaven, and whatever you permit on earth will be permitted in heaven." Roughly a decade after Jesus' death, Peter traveled to Rome, where he became the leader of the Roman Church. But this would prove to be a perilous position. In the year 64, great fires raged through the city, burning most of it down. Emperor Nero was quick to assign a scapegoat and blamed this catastrophe on the Christian minority. Peter was amongst the thousands of Christians condemned to death by crucifixion. It is said that Peter requested to be crucified upside down because he felt unworthy to die in a similar manner as his Lord and Savior Christ. Upon his death as a martyr, Peter was almost immediately venerated as one of the very first saints. His life and death laid the foundations for the Roman Catholic Church to proclaim itself as the true spiritual center of the Christian faith. Despite various periods of prosecutions of its religious communities sanctioned by different emperors, Christianity was steadily becoming more widely adopted. As a fervent devotee to the traditional gods of Rome, Emperor Galerius was inimical to the rise of Christianity. He had been credited with spurring on his 3 colleagues to sanction repression and persecution of the Christians' communities across the empire. In the year 303, the Tetrarchy ordered official edicts curtailing their legal rights and compelled them to make sacrifices to the Roman pantheon. Refusal to do so meant they could face imprisonment or even execution. This period would become known as the Great Persecution, making the start of one of the most severe periods of persecutions of the Christians in Roman history. Shortly after, the 2 senior members both voluntarily abdicated and passed on the office of Augusti to their promising successors, Galerius and Constantius. With the seats of Caesar now vacant, Galerius, in a show of nepotism, raised his nephew Maximinus Daza to rule as Caesar in the eastern half of the empire. He also pressed his politically advantageous position and bypassed Constantius by appointing a personal ally by the name of Severus as Caesar in the west. When the popular Constantius died a natural death in Epocharum in the year 306, Galerius immediately made plans to elevate Severus to become the Augustus of the west. However, his plans were thwarted when the legions in Britannia loyal to the deceased Constantius immediately elected his son Constantine, pronouncing him the heir to his father's throne. As for his new ascension to emperor, he just happened to be at the right place at the right time at the moment of his father's death, as he had only recently been able to depart the east and join up with his father's army just before they crossed over to continue their campaign in Britannia. Constantine, also known as Flavius Valerius Constantinus, was around 30 years old. For political reasons, he had spent his adolescence in the eastern half of the empire, far away from the province ruled by his father. However, due to his lineage, he had naturally been given a privileged position within the army, and had already gained valuable military experience as a commander. Despite witnessing the severe persecution of the Christians from close by, his time in the culturally rich cities of Asia Minor exposed him to their communities where he may have personally become somewhat positively predisposed towards their faith. Interestingly, at this time in his life, Constantine may have been drawn toward the cult of Sol Invictus, a popular strand of Roman religion that, while still part of the broader pantheon, placed special emphasis on a single supreme sun god. For those who held such beliefs, this focus on a dominant, all-powerful deity may have found more common ground with the Christians than those who clinged to the polytheistic pantheon. The somewhat spontaneous elevation of Constantine to fill the shoes of his father was in defiance to Galerius's plans. Constantine claimed that the decision was simply forced upon him by the army, but naturally the timing of his arrival in Britannia had been suspicious. Realizing that outright refusing the decision of the military might result in conflict and potentially civil war, Galerius chose to compromise and be diplomatic about the inconvenient affair. In an attempt to show good faith, he agreed to admit him to the Tetrarchy, but instead of appointing him Augustus, his role would be limited to Caesar, at least initially. Realizing that this was probably the best offer he was going to get, Constantine accepted the diplomatic proposal. This meant he would be serving under Severus, who was raised to Augustus instead, according to Galerius' initial plans. As much as Rome is a nation legendary for its indomitable conquest, its history is equally renowned for its frequent and bloody civil wars. Just like Rome's founding myth of Romulus and Remus is a story of rivalry and fratricide. It should come as no surprise that these brooding rivalries might similarly result in a conflict for dominance. Unfortunately for Galerius, his plans would be further thwarted. Inspired by the succession of Constantine as heir to his father, Maxentius, the son of the now retired Maximian, saw no reason why he should be passed over himself, and also made a bid for the throne. Maxentius was conveniently stationed near the city of Rome when a revolt broke out over taxation and the potential dissolution of the Praetorian Guard. This suspiciously opportune event was quickly exploited through the political network established by his father, who also happened to be in the city. Maxentius presented himself as the champion of Rome and its traditions. He promised lower taxation and to restore the city to its former prestige as the rightful capital of the empire. This populist campaign proved effective, and so before the Tetrarchy had any opportunity to counter it, Maxentius already had himself proclaimed emperor by the Praetorian Guard and Roman Senate. However, in contrast to Constantine, whose admission to the Tetrarchy had been legitimized, this one was largely seen as an illegitimate usurpation of the throne. Seeing that the city of Rome fell under the domain of the newly appointed Severus, who himself had only been emperor for less than a year, he mustered his army in Mediolanum and marched south to depose the usurper. However, for decades the soldiers of his army had fought and bled under command of Maximian, and upon approaching the city, many chose to defect to their former commander instead. Almost overnight, losing most of his military to the usurpers, Severus retreated back to Ravenna, but eventually surrendered to Maxentius under promises of safety. Unfortunately for the captured emperor, perhaps hoping that it would dissuade anyone else from invading, Maxentius broke his promise and ordered Severus to commit suicide. Despite this threat, the joint rule of father and son was tested again, when in response to their blatant treachery, Galerius mustered an even larger army and also marched on Rome.
If you're watching this video because you're into military history, I'm sure you will enjoy Warthunder. Warthunder is the most comprehensive vehicle combat game ever made. It is available for free on PC, consoles and even mobile devices. You can take command over 2500 tanks, planes, helicopters and ships of 10 different nations, ranging from historical vehicles from the early 20th century to the modern tanks of today. Incredibly detailed vehicles, realistic graphics and authentic sound design provide an immersive experience. Join the worldwide community of Warthunder with 95 million players in their epic multiplayer battles. The game has a game mode and vehicle for every type of player. Whether you like realism or a more arcade playing style, this game has it all. Warthunder is truly suited to the fans of military history and you can sign up now for free. By using the links in the pinned comment or video description, you get a massive bonus pack available to new players. This includes exclusive vehicle decorations, in-game currency, 7 days of premium account and more. And if you already have a Warthunder account but haven't played for 6 months, you can use my links to get the same bonus. This offer is available for a limited time only, so don't forget to claim it now.
But in a fashion similar to how they dealt with the prior invasion, they once again successfully bribed large portions of the invading army and convinced them to come over to their side. As more and more men were deserting Galerius's army and his enemy's forces growing behind the fortified walls of Rome, Galerius realized his situation was far from favorable and would not be able to retake Italy. Without a major battle, he strategically retreated back to his power base in the east. To prevent further desertions, he gave his legionaries free rein to pillage the countryside and gather loot as they departed from Italy. Despite Maxentius being considered an illegitimate rival, his successful repelling of 2 invasion forces proved that he was a force to be reckoned with. Maxentius opportunistically began to seek friendly relations with Constantine, who so far had kept himself out of the conflict. In a display of diplomacy, Maximian offered the hand of his daughter Fausta as a political marriage proposal, which Constantine accepted. The arrangement strengthened his own position, as the newly formed alliance meant an invasion into Gaul was unlikely, and it made him a potential successor of Maxentius's reign. The gambit of father and son had paid off, but with Maxentius's power base in Italy now firmly secured, he no longer had much use for the prestigious legacy of his father and began to sideline him. Unsurprisingly, this resulted in an attempt by the scorned Maximian to depose his own ungrateful son. However, his coup failed, and he lost his hold over the military. He was forced to flee Rome and took refuge with Constantine. who, due to the marriage with his daughter, had become his son-in-law. Galerius saw the opportune moment to organize a council in Carnuntum. This meeting was attended by himself, the ousted Maximian, the retired Diocletian, and another new candidate for the Tetrarchy by the name of Licinius, another one of Galerius's personal allies. During this meeting, Maximian was presumably scolded for assisting his son in appropriating the capital, as this caused massive amounts of political instability for the empire. Once again, implored to retire from the political domain, he reluctantly agreed to abandon his claims to the throne. Instead, Licinius was proclaimed Augustus of the West, a decision that blatantly bypassed the seniority of Constantine. To facilitate the four emperors and the usurper simultaneously, the partitions of the empire were slightly redrawn to contain a fifth domain carved out in Illyricum, where Licinius could rule. This was only intended as a temporary arrangement, however, as Licinius was tasked with retaking control over Italy and deposing the illegitimate Maxentius in order to restore the Tetrarchy. In 310, Galerius fell mortally ill, possibly with a form of bowel cancer. Although still nominally in power, he withdrew from the political domain. In the final years of his life, he admitted that his policies to eradicate Christianity had failed. Instead, the religion had steadily been growing, and by now roughly 10% of the empire's population was Christian, and in some major cities the number may have been as high as 20%. Unsurprisingly to the Christians who had suffered under his reign, the ailing emperor's suffering might have seemed like a form of divine justice. Ironically enough, he now implored the Christians to pray on behalf of the empire, and possibly even for his own health. He also set edicts into motion to finally stop the officially sanctioned persecution of the Christians. They ought to pray to their God for our safety, for that of the Republic, and for their own, that the Republic may continue uninjured on every side, and that they may be able to live securely in their homes. In this power vacuum, the aging Maximian could not resist one final bid for the throne and attempted to stage a coup in the power base of Arles in southern Gaul by spreading the false news that Constantine was dead. Upon hearing the news, Constantine quickly called off his campaign against the Franks and hastily marched south to confront the usurper. The reputation of the twice-retired emperor had been waning, and he failed to gather enough supporters willing to indulge his claims and form a force large enough to resist Constantine's army. Maximian fled and fortified himself in the port city of Marseille. When Constantine proceeded to besiege the city, its inhabitants decided to hand over the usurper. Constantine stripped him of his titles, but rather than outright killing him, encouraged him to commit suicide, a request to which the utterly disgraced Maximian eventually obliged. The conflict had only just begun when in 311, Galerius passed away. His domains in Asia Minor and Thrace were squabbled over between Maximinus Daza and Licinius. Opportunistically, Maximinus quickly expanded his eastern domains towards the shores of the Bosphorus by hastily capturing key cities and administrative centers. By disregarding the council of the Tetrarchy and moving faster than Licinius, he had unrightfully secured for himself the majority of the territories. But neither side was willing to risk immediate war, and the dispute was eventually settled with an awkward peace agreement. Meanwhile, despite his early successes, Maxentius's rule was proving largely unpopular because his promises for lower taxation had not materialized. His image was shifting from a champion of Rome to a feeble tyrant unable to keep his word. Because of this, most of the provinces in Spain realigned themselves with Constantine instead. During his rule, several imperial provinces of the North African coastline had rebelled and proclaimed their own emperor by the name of Domitius Alexander. His brief rebellious reign was squashed when he was decisively defeated by the forces of Maxentius. However, the rapid erosion of Maxentius's authority was clear for all to see. He was still in power, but the writing of his demise was on the wall. Constantine formed a diplomatic alliance with Licinius by offering a marriage proposal with his younger half-sister Constantia, which was accepted. But the celebrations would have to wait until after the conflict was resolved. To counterbalance this alliance, Maximinus Daza offered to legitimize Maxentius's rule in exchange for military support if war should break out. The increasingly desperate Maxentius now began to mobilize his armies, stationing them in the Po Valley of northern Italy, or, alternatively, to attack into Illyricum if conflict between Licinius and Maximinus Daza was to break out. Hypocritically, he also rebuked Constantine for the defamation and death of his father, and ordered the destruction of any statues that had been constructed in Constantine's honor. The Tetrarchy had now completely collapsed, and two opposing sides were inevitably about to go to war. The question remained who would strike first. Back in Gaul, Constantine had been biding his time, consolidating his power base by stamping out revolts, recruiting Frankish mercenaries, and preparing his legions for the inevitable civil war. Although his soothsayers advised against performing a preliminary campaign against Maxentius due to unfavorable omens, he ignored these warnings and decided it was time to make his move. In the early spring of 312, he proceeded to march his army across the Alps into Italy anyway. This audacious move was perhaps one of the first major signs that Constantine was no longer swayed by the edicts of the old Roman religion and superstitions. Constantine gathered an army of 40,000 men, composed of hardened veterans from the many campaigns in Gaul, and marched them over the Cottian Alps, through the Mont Cenis Pass, into northern Italy. When the city of Segusio refused to open its gates to the invaders, it was besieged. They attacked the walls with scaling ladders and set fire to the gate. The garrison was quickly defeated and the city captured. Constantine wished to be seen as a benevolent liberator rather than an invader, and so he ordered his soldiers to put out the fires and prevented them from sacking the city. Near Turin, his march onwards was opposed by an army loyal to Maxentius that contained a heavily armed cataphract force. To counter this, he positioned his troops in a way that enticed the cavalry to charge into the center of their ranks. His own cavalry would then make repeated charges from the flanks, wielding specialized iron clubs suited for dealing with the heavily armored enemy horsemen. Constantine was known for regularly leading his elite cavalry into the midst of battle himself, and it's likely that this engagement was no exception. The strategy proved effective, and the cataphracts were all but slaughtered or put to flight. After a brief infantry engagement, the remaining enemy troops fled to Turin, but the city closed its gates and refused to let them in. Denied refuge and unable to escape the pursuit, they were slaughtered by Constantine's forces outside the walls. In light of these military successes, Milan strategically opened their gates to Constantine and hailed his arrival with celebrations. He was stationed here for several months in order to consolidate infrastructure needed to stabilize his supply routes over the Alps and prepare his army for the campaign ahead. When he deemed his army ready for the battles to come, he continued his campaign by marching on Brescia. Here, they were once again impeded by heavy cavalry forces, sent by the commander of the Praetorian Guard called Ruricius Pompeianus, in order to halt their advance. Constantine ordered his own cavalry to charge. They promptly forced the enemy to flee back to the city of Verona, where a large Maxentian army had gathered under Pompeianus. With Maxentian's forces dispersed after the field battle, Brescia's garrison had no hopes of withstanding a siege and surrendered to Constantine. The rank-and-file troops were offered amnesty and were likely assimilated into the army, and just like Turin, the city was spared from pillaging. The army then moved on to Verona, and Constantine ordered his troops to besiege the strongly fortified city. This was not an easy task, as the city lay in a natural bend in the river on three sides. Before this encirclement was completed, the defenders sallied forth into open battle. Despite their brave confrontation, they were promptly defeated. Pompeianus managed to escape, but chose not to abandon the beleaguered city. To his credit, he managed to muster even more troops in the local area and returned with another army, intending to lift the siege. Upon hearing of the relief forces' approach, Constantine split his army in two parts. One half would maintain the siege, while the other, under direct command of Constantine himself, would engage Pompeianus in battle. The battle raged into the night, onto the next morning, and when the sun rose, Pompeianus was found amongst the dead. The enemy commander had been killed in the melee, and his army defeated. Unsurprisingly, the remaining garrison in Verona surrendered. After the string of Constantine's military successes, and realizing where the winds were blowing, other cities in northern Italy chose to defect to his cause. Although this march south over the Via Flaminia towards the capital may have seen some minor skirmishing. It went largely uncontested. Just like the previous invasions, Maxentian was fortifying his position behind the strong Aurelian walls of Rome, preparing for a siege. He ordered the bridges across the Tiber to be destroyed. However, his cowardly refusal to confront his opponent in open battle was a perceived weakness that continued to erode his authority, especially with the citizens of Rome, who understandably had little appetite to be at the receiving end of a prolonged siege. Constantine was well aware of this sentiment and approached the city at a measured pace, biding his time while Maxentian's grip on the city unraveled. But eventually, his forces reached the outskirts of Rome. Instead of letting the siege commence, Maxentian surprisingly ordered the construction of an improvised pontoon crossing next to the dismantled Milvian Bridge and marched his army outside of the city. Constantine's army had marched up to Saxa Rubra, a plain roughly 9 miles from the city of Rome, when he heard the news that Maxentius had come forth to face his army in pitched battle. On October the 27th, both armies set up camp and prepared for the fight that would inevitably happen the next day. According to an almost mythical recollection of events, on the eve of battle, Constantine is reported to have received visions from the Christian god. Looking up towards the sky, he saw a sign of the cross, or more accurately, the symbol of Cairo. In his dreams later that night, he was presumably provided with even more revelations and implored through heavenly commandment to adopt the sign in order to conquer. Subsequently, Constantine must have wasted no time in ordering his troops to paint the symbol onto their shields. For the next day, the symbol was evidently present with Constantine's army. During the deployment, the imperial standard of Constantine, also known as the labarum, proudly carried the symbol up high. Although not directly recognizable as the quintessential Christian Latin cross, the Cairo is nevertheless a Christian symbol, as it is a monogram combining the first 2 letters of Christ's name when spelled in Greek. Maxentian's forces were deployed on the northern bank of the Tiber, with their right flank towards the river. His army was large, possibly around 75,000 men. Although it contained some elite troops like the Praetorian Guard and legionaries, a significant portion was made up of relatively inexperienced levies from the area and Africa. Few of these had ever experienced the sort of combat that had turned Constantine's frontier army into battle-hardened veterans. Knowing that Constantine would have to match this, Maxentius wisely positioned his own bulk of cavalry near the river, which limited their mobility and curtailed Constantine's cavalry advantages on the flanks. With the formations lined up, the decisive battle was drawing near. Constantine ordered his own cavalry wing forward, along with his skirmishers, and Maxentius mirrored the approach, personally leading the charge. With the thunderous sound of beating hooves, Constantine and his riders clashed violently with the enemy. The cavalry engagement was fierce, for whoever emerged victorious here would have a decisive advantage in battle. Spurred on by Constantine himself, his force eventually managed to rout the enemy riders and chase them from the field. Now it was time for the legionaries to advance. The labarum standard was raised high as the troops moved forward. Emboldened by the initial success of their commander, morale of Constantine's troops must have been high. In shrill contrast, the forces of Maxentius gritted their teeth, knowing that the battle ahead would be a tough one. The Praetorian Guard in particular knew that they stood much to lose in defeat. Their support for Maxentius hinged largely on his promises to preserve their ancient institution and prestige as the emperor's royal guard. Throughout the centuries, this position had granted them much political power as kingmakers, and their notorious reputation had already earned them much scrutiny. They were well aware that this was something that Constantine would certainly seek to abolish. With every step, the 2 lines marched closer. Volleys of pila were exchanged until the 2 armies were at an arm's distance to commence the battle with swords. The melee was fierce. The veterans from the Rhine frontier showed their professionalism, methodically cutting down the less combat-experienced Italian troops. But the Praetorian Guard in particular stood their ground unflinchingly, showing their commitment to fight till the bitter end, as the infantry lines mercilessly ground each other down. Another large cavalry engagement was about to go down on the flank. Maxentius's cavalry galloped towards Constantine, perhaps hoping that killing the emperor would turn the tides of battle back in their favor. But Constantine's cavalry stood their ground, and eventually came out on top and pushed their foe back. With the flank of his infantry exposed, Maxentius and his troops knew the battle would be lost. Maxentius ordered a general retreat back across the pontoon bridge, intending to make another stand in the city itself. However, with Constantine's cavalry opportunistically chasing the enemy wherever possible, unsurprisingly the retreat turned into a panicked rout. Only the Praetorian Guard held their ground and valiantly died where they stood. A mass of fleeing soldiers rushed back towards Rome, but the pontoon bridge was not sturdy enough to withstand the disorderly stream of men racing across. Reportedly, Maxentius was still caught on the northern side of the Tiber when it collapsed. With no avenue to escape, the panic became total. With Constantine's army hot on their heels and fearing to be put to the sword, masses of men threw themselves into the Tiber to swim or wade across in desperate attempts to save their skins. Dragged down by their armor or their comrades, many of them drowned. Swept up in the chaos of his panicking army, the usurper drowned alongside countless numbers of his men. After the massacre, his body was recognized and dragged out of the river to be decapitated. His head was put on a spike and paraded through the city to prove to everyone that the usurper's reign was over. The battle for Rome had been brief and decisive. Constantine, the first Roman emperor to carry the symbol of Christ into battle, had emerged victorious. The Praetorian Guard was indeed completely disbanded. Not long after securing control of Italy, Constantine and Licinius met in Milan as allies, where they handled a wide range of political matters in order to stabilize the empire. Although Licinius had initially been appointed by the late Galerius to become Augustus in the west, he did not press his claims. Instead, he would concern himself with the east, and it is likely that their meeting included plans on how to handle a potential conflict with Maximinus Daza. Furthermore, he committed to the promised marriage arrangement with Constantia, taking her as his wife and connecting their family into an alliance. Foremost amongst their discussion was the matter of Christianity. Despite Constantine not being baptized yet, his vision and consequent victory at the Battle of Milvian Bridge had primed him irrevocably towards favoring the faith. Although his conversion was gradual, he had all but become a dedicated Christian by now. Licinius maintained his belief in the Roman gods, but in order to appease Constantine, maintained no stance of opposition towards Christianity, and the two emperors agreed upon official policy changes towards the religion. In a declaration generally known as the Edict of Milan, they provided Christians with legal rights and protections that should prevent further persecution, going much further than the Edict of Toleration Galerius had issued upon his deathbed. They made efforts to restore confiscated properties and provide compensation to Christians that had suffered abuse. This was the true turning point for Christianity in the Roman Empire. Under Constantine's rule, the domains in the Western Roman Empire would begin to imperially favor Christianity over the classical pantheon. However, the meeting was cut short when news arrived that Maximinus Daza was marching west. He had mustered 70,000 men and marched through Asia Minor towards Byzantium. In April 313, he crossed the Bosphorus and besieged the city from the western side, capturing it within 2 weeks, and then continued his campaign by marching on the coastal city of Heraclea. Although this move had not been completely unexpected, his opponent's march all the way from Syria during the harsh conditions of winter had caught Licinius by surprise. He returned head over heels towards his domain in Thrace in order to stage a defense. Due to the lack of preparations, he was only able to gather 30,000 troops before reaching Adrianople. The two armies would eventually meet at Zeralum, where the battle commenced. Despite being outnumbered 2-1, Licinius emerged victorious. Despite the crushing defeat, Daza managed to escape and fled to Nicomedia, where he began the slow process of rebuilding his army. Realizing he did not have enough men to stop an invasion, he strategically continued his withdrawal all the way to Tarsus. The forces of Licinius pursued and were able to secure the territories they passed through uncontested. It wasn't long before Maximinus's authority completely collapsed, and before the two emperors could meet in another decisive battle, he died, likely killed by poison. Licinius could now proclaim himself Augustus over the entire eastern half of the Roman Empire. However, Licinius reportedly had little interest in upholding the religious freedoms promised by the Edict of Milan, and over time, persecutions of Christians in the East continued to persist. Prolonged inaction by Constantine against this injustice would erode the credibility of his reputation as the self-proclaimed protector of Christianity. When subsequently Constantine discovered a plot against him, orchestrated by the close associates of Licinius, and negotiations to hand over the conspirators broke down, conflict once more loomed on the horizon. Constantine once more chose to launch a preliminary campaign against his rival, and marched his army deep into Illyricum, carrying his revered Labarum banner everywhere he went. The first time the two sides clashed was during the Battle of Cybele, which after a hard-fought battle turned out to be a decisive victory for Constantine that forced Licinius's battered army to retreat to Thrace. Constantine pursued, and the second time the two emperors clashed was during the Battle of Mardia, some 300 kilometers west of Byzantium. Although suffering heavy losses, once again Constantine emerged victorious. Licinius managed to keep his army together for an organized withdrawal during the night. Logically assuming that Licinius had fallen back towards Byzantium, the next day Constantine pursued. However, he was caught by surprise when he suddenly found the enemy in his rear. Unexpectedly, Licinius had moved his army north, and by allowing Constantine to pass, he could bore down upon his rearguard and cut off his supply lines. Although he had been on the back foot for most of the conflict, his superior positioning forced Constantine to the negotiating table. The two men agreed upon a peace treaty. The deal included terms that would cede Illyricum to Constantine, and bestowed his teenage sons Crispus and the much younger Constantine II with the titles of Caesars. However, Licinius would not leave empty-handed, and had his own son, Licinius II, bestowed with the same title. Although this arrangement put an end to the civil war, the rivalry between the two dynasties had only been further reinforced. The peace would hold for 7 years, but hostilities eventually resumed when Constantine, under the pretense of chasing an army of Goths, crossed his army into Licinius's territories. The response was overly hostile, proving that the empire had been truly divided into two competing governments that hardly tolerated each other. Once again, Central Europe was the place where the two emperors clashed, and during the Battle of Adrianople, once again fighting under the yet undefeated Labarum standard, Constantine inflicted a crushing defeat upon his opponent. Licinius fell back to Byzantium, but ferried the major part of his army over the Bosphorus into Asia Minor. While Constantine proceeded to besiege the city, he left his son Crispus in command of the naval forces to defeat the navy of Licinius and lay the groundwork for their eventual crossing. Despite his fleet being severely outnumbered, Crispus managed to secure an overwhelming victory in the Hellespont. During their final clash, a storm hit and wrecked the enemy fleet almost completely. Their victory was total, and the crossing across the strait secured. Their next and final battle was at Chrysiopolis. Reportedly by now, the undefeated Labarum had reached a talismanic status, boosting the resolve of Constantine's troops while striking fear into his enemies. As if truly blessed by divine favor, Constantine once more achieved a crushing defeat over his foe. Despite suffering heavy losses, Licinius was able to withdraw his battered army to Nicomedia, but realized that further resistance would prove futile. He surrendered himself. His wife, Constantia, the half-sister of Constantine, acted as a mediator in the surrender and urged Constantine to spare his life. However, months later, after being accused of plotting against Constantine, the former emperor and his son were executed regardless. With only one emperor remaining, the civil war was finally over. In the year 324, Emperor Constantine began to move his capital east to Byzantium. This newly crowned capital of the empire was to become Nova Roma, but would eventually be renamed after the emperor into Constantinople, which simply means City of Constantine. This decision to move the seat of power had been primarily motivated by strategic and economic reasons, but also partly shifted the center of the Christian religion towards the east. Even by this time, Christianity was no longer as simple as a singular doctrine. Due to language and cultural differences within the empire, various interpretations of the faith started to emerge in different provinces, most notably Arianism, a doctrine named after a charismatic priest called Arius from Alexandria, which preached an alternative interpretation about the divinity of Christ. The difference lay in Arianism preaching that Jesus was the Son of God rather than God himself. Although it may appear like a semantic issue of minor significance to some, it would be a major contribution towards a growing split within the Church. To resolve these differences and uphold a unified doctrine, Constantine organized the Council of Nicaea. This was an important gathering, attended by more than 200 bishops, whose traveling expenses in order to attend were covered by the imperial treasury of Emperor Constantine. The foremost topic of discussion in the meeting was the vehement disagreement over the rhetorical difference in describing the divinity of Christ himself, whether he was God or merely the Son of God created by him. Things supposedly got so heated that Arius reportedly got slapped by a bishop called Nicholas of Myra during the debates, for which the hot-headed bishop was chastised. Interestingly enough, this very same bishop would become Saint Nicholas, which serves to inspire both Santa Claus and the Dutch tradition of Sinterklaas. Eventually, the council officially decreed that the Holy Trinity of the Father, Son, and Holy Spirit was one God, and that indeed Jesus was God when he came down to earth in the form of man, for the sake of humanity's salvation. Additionally, they decided on the correct day for celebrating Easter and various administrative church proceedings. This sanctioned doctrine would henceforth become known as the Nicene Creed and would be enforced by the emperor. Arianism and any deviations were officially labeled heretical. There remained those who refused to submit to the Nicene Creed, and they were excommunicated and exiled, and over time, many ended up in Illyricum. If any writings composed by Arius should be found, it should be handed over to the flames, so that not only will the wickedness of his teachings be obliterated, but nothing will be left even to remind anyone of him. The strong condemnation did not stop their preachers from spreading the Arian teachings around in areas of Central Europe. Despite being forced to move in the shadows for now, Arianism would yet prove to have a crucial role to play in the shaping of European culture and Christianity. Despite continuing a strong unified reign, when in the year 330 Constantinople officially became the empire's capital, in hindsight, this marked the beginning of the end for the western half of the empire. The heart of the empire now lay in the east, and less resources flowed to the city of Rome itself. Gradually, the western provinces became of less importance overall. Perhaps as a provocation for war, he wrote a letter to the Sasanian king Shapur II, issuing that he proclaimed patronage over all the Christians living in the east, and imploring him to treat them well. Perhaps, unsurprisingly, the Persians were neither amused nor intimidated. They once more invaded the client state of Armenia in an attempt to reconquer it from the Romans. As early as 301, Armenia had converted and became the first official Christian state. Its protection was of spiritual importance to Constantine, and so he made plans for a military campaign against the Sasanians. If these plans had come to fruition, considering the religious importance Constantine attributed to the planned invasion and urging bishops to accompany the army, it may have very well been considered one of the very first crusades. However, preparations for the campaign were called off when Constantine became mortally ill in the year 337. He realized the end of his life was drawing near. He had put off baptism for as long as he could, possibly hoping that by delaying it until the very last moment, the absolvement of his sins would allow him to enter into heaven with as clean a slate as possible, although he preferred to be baptized in the Jordan River where Christ had been baptized. His poor health likely no longer allowed for such a journey. Instead, he was baptized in Nicomedia by an Eastern priest named Eusebius, who, surprisingly, despite Constantine's strong condemnation of Arius, would later openly preach Arianism himself. Perhaps tellingly for the fact that the eternal city of Rome no longer played much of a role in the emperor's life. Upon his death, he was buried in Constantinople in the Church of the Holy Apostles, the building of which he had ordered himself during his reign. The champion of Christianity had passed away, and the reign of the empire was handed over to his 3 remaining sons, Constantine II, Constantius II, and Constans I. Perhaps Constantine's most immediate and striking legacy was the symbol he had left behind. The symbol of the eagle, which had been proudly carried throughout the entire history of Rome, would be replaced by the Cairo as the main sign of the Roman Empire. In the year 381, under Emperor Theodosius I, Christianity was elevated as the official state religion, despite the Romans maintaining a strong rule with Nicene Christianity as the dominant religion uniting the empire. After his death in 395, the empire was again divided between his sons Arcadius and Honorius into the East and Western Roman empires. Like before, both halves remained nominally united, but governed by 2 separate administrations. But this time the split would prove to be permanent. Along the borders of the empire, beyond the Rhine and the Danube, the world is stirring. Barbarian nations, hitherto kept at bay at the empire's borders, begin to move, driven forward into the frontier regions by a nebulous threat from the east. And just when the Romans are about to face their most formidable challenge yet, the empire is divided. The Western Roman Empire, already weakened compared to the East, may find itself unable to cast out the invaders. For the coming storm that gathers is not one of a single battle, but a tidal wave of invasions strong enough to reshape the very structure of Europe itself. The city of Rome, and consequently the Holy Church of St. Peter, shall soon find itself at the heart of a storm, with the force to usher in a new age.
Thanks to Warthunder for sponsoring this history video. Before you go, don't forget to check out their amazing game, and if you want, you can use my links in the pinned comment or description to sign up for their exclusive welcome bonus pack.